Testing, testing. So, should I begin?
Yes, sir.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Ken here. I think if you sat through this morning's sessions, trust definitely has been mentioned so many times that it's so fundamental. And then now it's in the digital world, and digital trust is the way forward. So now we put this perspective into messaging, all right? So welcome, Anurag, to Singapore.
Thank you.
Yes, you flew all the way, I think 20 over hours from Boston or Washington, right?
Washington, yeah.
Okay, so as far as I know, everybody is doing messaging, right? So even now, some of you are doing messaging as well. Well, I always have a lot of curiosity about messaging. I think I get very excited, not just by the digital trust notion today. I think putting this in the context of messaging is very interesting and really very exciting to have Anurag today, who has been in the messaging business for many years. I think to start with, I always have this curiosity, right? The messaging platform and the operator always say that, oh, don't worry, we have end-to-end encryption, and you are always very safe. Is it really safe, Anurag?
Well, that's a great question. But before I start, I think I just want to take a couple of minutes to share my excitement of being here today. It's 3 years to the date that I was last in Singapore. And I'm delighted that we are able to meet and mingle the way we are today, despite all the goings-ons over the last 3 years. And to give context to Ken's, actually, before I even get there, I think it's important for me to also recognize the great work that SG Tech has done with regards to this study. We were delighted to partner with SG Tech and provide whatever insight we could. But I think it's an amazing study that really talks about the leadership that Singapore is providing in the region. And this is really nothing new for Singapore, because over the years I've had the opportunity to witness Singapore really lead in so many areas across the economy. And I think here's a great opportunity and a great chance for Singapore to do it again in the context of digital trust. Now, let's talk again, give you context with regards to the question that Ken just asked. How in the context of messaging, is it truly secure and it's truly encrypted? But even before I get there, I think it's really important to understand how we got here. Over the last 3 years, we were all challenged. And at the start of March, actually January of 2020, when we first started hearing about the pandemic, we saw an exponential acceleration of the digitization of the enterprise. And that was done in an act of desperation, because companies had to run their businesses. They had to make sure that they could survive. So we essentially saw a 7-year acceleration that took place with the digitization of the enterprise. And it was led by a bunch of different areas where enterprises needed to invest and make happen for their business to run. Cloud was one. The previous speaker talked about the cloud, and without cloud availability, I don't think we would have been able to make it through. The other area that was also very, very important were certain sets of application that kind of skyrocketed to the top, right? Obviously, mobility and connectivity was very, very important. But there were 2 specific sets of application through research done by Pew, which categorized themselves into mobile messaging and collaboration. And those were 2 areas that became extremely important to end users. And not only did the use of those technologies kind of leapfrog ahead everything else, but the challenges related to those technologies leapfrogged as well. Now, as Ken mentioned, we're in the business of providing secure, encrypted messaging platforms to the enterprise. A lot of the brands that you heard from and will hear from during the course of these sessions actually leverage our technology to maintain their level of trust with their own constituents, customers, etc. And the reason messaging has become so important is because each and every one of you kind of voted by your use of messaging. Messaging, mobile messaging in this context, allows you to very briefly and very contextually deliver a succinct message, and data shows us it gets responded to in an average of 15 minutes, right? Email wait time is much longer. So everybody loves it. And I can even bet you another piece of statistic, actually by a show of hands, help me here. How many of you have a mobile messaging application like WhatsApp, Kakao, Viber, etc. on your phone right now? Just raise your hands. Raise your hands. So it's pretty much everybody in this room, right? Now this next question I won't ask you because it's a little controversial, but I'll state it nonetheless. How many of you have actually used those mobile messaging, consumer-grade messaging platforms to conduct business? And I will bet you money a large portion of those hands that went up would be raised again because of the convenience of what those platforms provide, right? You can't take it away from them. They've done a great job of delivering that. Now the challenge comes, and going back to Ken's question, so apologies for taking my time, but I thought it was important to set the stage here. The challenge here is those platforms are great when used in the context of what they were meant to, which was to enable and encourage consumer engagement through messaging as a platform. They were never ever built for the enterprise or never ever built with a promise of security or enterprise control, right? So due to the pandemic, these applications encroached their way in, and that's where challenges started. And those challenges are real. Let's be clear. One of the things that we saw during the course of the pandemic is the use of our platform went to skyrocketed. The reason being is people were looking for a solution that gave them the peace of mind, the encryption and control that allowed them to leverage the strength of mobile messaging, but in the context of the enterprise. And their existing solutions weren't delivering that. So, but at the same point of time, they were doing that because they had a recognition that with the extension of boundaries outside of the office, people now working remotely, all of a sudden, the security blanket that was evident when the enterprise was in office, all of a sudden started to fade. And with that blanket removed, the chances of security threats and cyber attacks happening again skyrocket, right? We saw a 300% increase in cyber-related crime in the United States alone. Here in Singapore, I think it was a 38% increase, but in Asia itself is a 167% increase. And this will continue. It'll continue over a period of time because going back in time, cyber was driven by some individual bad actors. It then became part of cyber crime, but now there are state actors who have jumped into it. So the sophistication of these crimes have grown exponentially. So that's why it's imperative. It's imperative, and going back to Ken's question, it's imperative when you do want to leverage the strength of mobile messaging, do it in a responsible manner. Our solution certainly works and delivers that responsible use of mobile messaging with encryption, with the control, with the ability to audit, ability to be compliant to your regulatory obligations. And don't shy away from that dirty little secret because it's a ticking time bomb that's going to impact you one way or the other. Anyway, I apologize for the long answer, but I wanted to make sure people had context.
Yes, thank you for setting the stage. I think my curiosity remains still very strong. I am always very curious when, they were saying that this end-to-end encryption is safe, right? So there's always this thing in my mind that they always talk about end-to-end, but what is beyond the two ends, right? So, and as an end user, I believe a lot of you is aware, if you talk about certain topic, right, in a consumer messaging platform, the next moment you have is to see a lot of advertisement coming to you, which is oriented towards that context. So I'm not too sure whether you have this experience. I personally experienced that. So I reckon that a lot of things are in the working, and definitely this is not suitable for enterprise purposes, right? The fact that we are having all this platform for free, there's no free lunch anyway, right? So there is certain implication if we use it in the enterprise space. I'm not a messaging specialist, but more from cyber perspective. I would tend to see this from two key perspectives. One is privacy, all right? So just now I mentioned that what's beyond the two ends, that's privacy consideration. But cyber consideration is interesting. If you talk about encryption, right? For the longest time, encryption has been assisting us to protect our privacy for the longest time. Today, unfortunately, because advanced threat is so difficult to detect, encryptions are actually protecting viruses, all right? So most protection tools are detection-based. So we can't detect them, detect all of them. I mean, there are 500,000 new viruses, as far as I know, that's coming out in the world every day. Are we able to detect all of them? I think it's very challenging, right? So as long as some misses and you have the tunnel of encryption going through that conduit, that's it, you're protecting the viruses all the way to the core of your enterprise. And your EDR, your enterprise protection, they are mostly detection-based, right? So if you can't detect them, then things would happen. From cyber perspective, if you got ransomware, you are very, very lucky today because ransomware is loud and everybody know that you are infected. If you got advanced threat coming in, then too bad. You will stay quietly in the land and slowly proliferate. The next moment is your people will start to receive very context-aware phishing email, right? And that is actually the cause of the problem. And the effect is actually the context-sensitive phishing email. There's no point buying anti-phishing software to go against that. So all this, when you relate back to messaging, what happened if we use consumer messaging in the enterprise, right? So it's end-to-end encrypted. Somebody is going to send probably a file. It's very common, right? We send WinWord file, we send Office file, PDF, and this could be malicious. But the moment it comes all the way to your endpoint, it's bypassing all your enterprise protection. Maybe on these two aspects, privacy and attack vectors, let's hear more from Anurag. What is a comment? Because my view is very cyber perspective, not messaging perspective.
No, I totally understand, but I think you said a couple of things which are important to note. Firstly, you said that, when I use some of these applications, I immediately get follow-up emails and other things that are in context to what I had communicated using those applications. So understand, when you're using these applications, these companies are in the business of collecting contextual data. That is their essential business model. So for anybody to think that their information will be safe and secure because it claims some level of encryption, I think is essentially a misnomer. You have to educate yourself and understand the implications of using that platform. Now, end-to-end encryption is a term that's been loosely used in so many different contexts. But the first step of understanding what end-to-end encryption is all about is to really understand what are the two ends these folks are talking about. Because those two ends could be very different and allow multiple spots in the transmission of a message or a level of communication to be undermined and compromised. So again, it's very, very important to understand what that means. You can't lull yourself into a false sense of security just because you see that statement being thrown out. Means I'll tell you something interesting. I just found out recently that even the leadership team of one of the companies that actually markets one of those messaging apps have banned the use of their own app with their leadership team. They're a publicly traded company. They want to make sure that whatever the leadership team is talking about is kept secure, and so they don't want to use a platform that they inherently believe is not, because they've built it from the ground up, right? Plus, I think talking about education is really important. If you go and look at the App Store, right? The App Store, at least in the case of both Android and iOS, it's very specifically and clearly listed what level of information these applications are actually extracting from you. It's listed there in black and white. There are a whole range of stuff that they pull from you. A lot of them also pull content. Not only your GPS location, not only some of the stuff on your phone, but also content. And that's where the challenge comes. So now let's move forward into Ken's context across the board, right? Privacy is something that inherently is important to all of us, right? I always give people an example who are open to sharing their private data with applications these days. I asked them, I said, guys, are you comfortable sharing all this data? And most people, I was surprised, said, you know what, yeah, I love it. They give me a better user experience. It's my data. And, I get something in return. But most of them are saying that without a full realization of by giving that data out, what else are they compromising? They are receiving something back, but what do they not get? And so then I asked the question differently. I said, how would you feel if somebody was sitting outside your home with a set of binoculars peeping into your house constantly 24/7? And their answer then is absolutely not. I won't allow that. That's not right. But essentially what you guys are doing is a little bit of that. You're allowing someone to sit outside your environment and look in. And they're looking in using data. And so privacy, I think, is at the core of trust, and more so in the context of digital trust, because I think it was Bhaskar or it was Piyush who talked about how data is become one of the most sought after commodities. I call it something that's more valuable than gold, because it gives you access to information that then you can use to create a cause and effect. And this is the first time in the history where data at the amounts that it's being extracted and ultimately mined is unheard of. And then the choice comes back to all of us. It's our choice to keep that data private or keep it out there open. And that does not necessarily come across in the context of just messaging. That's true across the board.
Very interesting. So I reckon it boils down to the fundamental of whether it is a choice of whether we want to trade our privacy for convenience. I think that's always a fundamental, but I believe in a lot of enterprise contexts, this would not be something acceptable. And that, I think, brings to the point the criticality of fully protected, fully controlled environment for your enterprise messaging. I think we have covered the privacy portion. So coming from purely cyber perspective, I did mention that today my concern as I look at is that most protection tools are detection-based, right? I mean, pardon me for being a little bit technical into the protection paradigms, is if you look at the traditional protection of antivirus for the longest time, right, 3-4 decades, we have antivirus, then we have multi-antivirus, then someone invented something quite clever, it's called sandboxing, right? Then we have threat intelligence, machine learning, all sort of things. Unfortunately, they are all using the thinking of detection, right? So they are using the most advanced technology all the time, every time there's next gen, but with which reference point, I don't know, that they will detect the bad guys so that they will remove them. But the fundamental is, can we even detect them? We can't, right? So then anything that's slip through the gap, it get encrypted and it delivered to the other side, well protected, right? So that is the fundamental. So I reckon that with enterprise control, then we can customize to do, for example, like sanitization technology, which is fully detectionless, that is able to make sure that the data is cleansed before it's encrypted through the messaging platform. Is that the thought that if we come from cyber protection perspective, this is the way?
I think you raise a really good point, Ken, because cyber is a real cost of doing business to all of us, and it'll remain here and it'll continue to grow. So I think there was a statistic that talked about the cost of cyber threats in the last few years was about $3 trillion. $3 trillion, and parts of it were paid by folks sitting in this room because of the sophistication of those cyber attacks. And as Ken mentioned, ultimately, control within the enterprise is essential. Without control, you're not going to be able to achieve that end-to-end assurance of security as you communicate. Today, those of you who work for companies, every time you join a company, they give you an email address. That email address remains yours till the day you leave. When you leave, that email address, the minute you leave, is disconnected, and you can no longer use that to represent yourself on behalf of the company. The reason they're able to do that is because the IT organization within that organization has control of that platform. They know who gets on. They have a set of policies that are used to authenticate you on that platform. They also understand how it's being used and from where it's being used, et cetera, et cetera. So that control is essential. When you come out into the consumer realm, there is no control because it was never meant to be there. And without control, that platform becomes exponentially dangerous. I'll give you a great example. A company that's now a customer of ours had a large sales force that leveraged a consumer-based messaging app on the West Coast of the United States. And the large sales force considered about 50 or 60 people. They took it upon themselves, say, you know what, we're going to put out a WhatsApp group, and we're going to just communicate and collaborate with one another on RFPs and customer opportunities as they come about. Okay? And so the group was put forth by one of them who felt really good about being able to do that. 50 people on the group, everybody started exchanging information. Everything went well, and they won some deals. Along the way, a couple of those guys left the company. But since nobody had control over that forum, all of a sudden that data started leaking out of that closed user group, and it was open entirely. Forget the mining that was done by WhatsApp. And all of a sudden, some joined the competition. And this is a real example, guys. And stayed on to that group and collected data. So again, that's a great case in point of control. I'll tell you another story. It happened with me this time. At the start of the pandemic, everybody was putting business continuity plans in place to make sure the continuity of their business. Very important, right? And groups were formed to make sure that they could connect and discuss business continuity. Now, one part of our business is delivering solutions to large mobile operators too. I won't name the mobile operator, but this one particular mobile operator in this region decided to set up a business continuity plan group on WhatsApp. And by mistake added me. Now here I was, I woke up one morning and I see this message and I said, why am I on this group? So I ignored it till information started going back and forth. Now I recognized the gentleman's name who I thought added me, and I called him and informed him about it, and he apologized profusely and disconnected or took me off the group. By the way, later on they signed up for our service, which actually helped me tremendously. So again, without that control, we are all playing with fire. And the cost of cyber, as Ken mentioned, is huge. And if you compromise yourself, it's just a matter of time when you will be paying part of that, that ransomware request or part of whatever other way that they reach out and compromise your infrastructure.
Thank you. Very interesting case study. So on that, you prompted me to think about the operational aspect of enterprise messaging. Say today, I embark on an enterprise messaging platform. How do you actually transit the people into enterprise messaging? Because then we still need to communicate with other companies, right? And the so-called quote-unquote bad habits of using consumer messaging, the icons, the application is still in my phone, and then I will have the enterprise messaging icon as well. So how do you manage this and so-called discipline the people to be aware and just use the proper messaging for the proper purposes?
Yeah, so, at least based on our experience, we believe that the end user is the weakest link in the overall scheme of things. All of us included. Because of the sophistication of these attacks, we are responsible unknowingly, there's no malice here, unknowingly compromising the enterprise by doing certain stuff, whether it's bringing in a consumer messaging app or clicking on a phishing email, but that's a fact. So I think the first step is awareness. You have to drive awareness. Well, actually, I'll take that back. The first step is to recognize you have a problem, right? Before you can drive awareness, you have to recognize it. And once you recognize the problem, then you can take steps to drive a level of awareness. And I'm sitting over here telling you today we all have a problem, all right? So the first step's taken care of. Let's go to the second step, which is recognize and drive a level of awareness within the enterprise so that enterprise users understands the risk, understand how these folks are coming at you, understand what steps to take if they are compromised. Don't brush it under the rug and pretend nothing happened, right? Talk about it, report it, make sure that they are taking action so that the IT organization can take action, right? And the last step, going back to how can we make that happen, is to ensure that you mandate the use of these platforms. And it's very easily done. We've seen so many customers successfully do that across the globe, across culture. So it's not a cultural thing. It's once mandated, it will be used. Now, Ken has a great point. Well, we are communicating with everybody outside. If you pick the right platform, ours for one allows you to communicate internally and also externally with your partners, prospects, what have you. And it gives you access to all of that in an entirely encrypted and manageable manner. So pick the right solution. Okay, we've seen that some of the common solutions out there don't solve this problem, and you can name them: Slack, Zoom, what have you, Teams. They were never meant to solve that problem. So if you think because you've deployed those solutions, you're safe, you're not. Pick the right solution because this is a real problem. It's going to continue to get worse. And again, going back to what Ken said, it's about mandating it so that people use it at the end of the day. And again, the way we've developed it, and I know we've used the term frictionless a lot during the course of the last few sessions, but truly we built it, one, with the customer in mind. That's the first step. Customer behavior is so important. Customer interaction is so important. Two, we wanted to make it frictionless. We wanted to make it frictionless in the way it was deployed. We didn't want a massive thousands of dollar project that involved so many people. We wanted to do it simplistically, easily, and we also wanted to make sure once end users had access to the application, they didn't need formal training, they just started using it because it was simple, easy, and straightforward. Those are the kind of solutions will allow you to take care of the problem you described, Ken.
I reckon so. The way you have described is very clear. I would summarize in my perspective, in the perspective of people, process, technologies, right? So it's a change management thing. Of course, people is always the weakest point sometimes. I say sometimes because today technology has advanced to such stage that sometimes people may not be the weakest point. Look at deepfake video, right? If I'm very experienced technology guy, I may fall prey into a fake video as well. So on that, I think it's pretty interesting. It's about change control as well. It's not just a technology platform. I think we're running a little bit out of time, but I have one last very curious question in enterprise workplace, messaging and collaboration also, because I think we have been discussing a lot in the context of messaging, but I'm not too sure about the notion of collaboration. It actually prompted me to think about online meeting, right? I mean, all these are driven by the COVID the last few years. Last time, before COVID, before we know even how to spell COVID, if I say, let's get on an online meeting, I think you will look at me in a very weird way, right? So today is a norm. If you look back the past, ever since the BBC analyst blunder, right, you remember, to things like I'm not a cat, all sort of interesting encounter that we've gone through. Today, I believe that collaborative platform like digital meeting will be a very important part of this workplace enterprise platform as well. But of course, if we look at the landscape, there are also so-called, I wouldn't say consumer, but a little bit enterprise, but it's also sort of enterprise subscription kind of thing, cloud-based. And then you also have very, very enterprise kind of platform, and also very consumer kind. So would you like to share with us what would be our overall strategy on the choice of all these platforms for collaboration, other than just messaging?
No, I think it's important, and Ken, you bring up a real important point. I think it's important when you look to deploy a solution, and I think this is true regardless of what problem you're going to solve, you understand your issue and problems very well. Second, you go out there and vet the solutions well. Understand what you're buying and make sure you ask the questions so people, you make a buying decision in an educated manner. Third, I think it's really also important to understand in today's day of digitization, which is moving at an exponential pace, we all have to realize and understand that sometimes there isn't one size that fits all. Also, there isn't one solution that is a master of everything. So if that's the case, then you have to recognize and understand that in some instances, you may have to deploy more than a single solution to solve your problem. What we do it for a very specific use case, for a very specific problem. And we essentially provide the enterprise with an insurance policy so that they do not get involved in paying these large ransom amounts or have their infrastructure compromised, costing them millions of dollars to get resolved, right? But the organizations that have signed up for us recognized early on that they have a lot to lose if some of this information got into the public domain. Another one of our customers makes secret sauce literally secret sauce for some of these fast food chains. And they found that their end users were exchanging some of those formulas on WhatsApp, right? So they realized the problem, they understood the issue, they recognized that their existing products weren't solving it, and so they came out looking for a specialist product and they signed up for us. I'll give you another example. In the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, I think sometime in August, there was a write-up about 28 banks that had been fined about $1.8 billion for breaching their regulatory compliance because they were using a consumer messaging app in order to be able to message with one another. All of them had deployed Zoom and Teams, but they still had the problem because they didn't recognize it and didn't give their end users the solution they need to solve a real problem. I've always said nature finds a way. So some of them said, okay, we're going to ban mobile messaging. You can't do that. It means it's so inherently part of what we do as humans now, whether we like it or not. It's like taking all our phones away and putting them on a basket outside and saying you're not going to have access to it for the next 5 hours. Let me see how that works. It's not going to work. Some of us are going to go outside and grab our phones. So pick the right product, do your homework, understand your problem. One size does not fit all. Ask the questions, understand what that means when they say it's end-to-end encrypted, parse through that. And as long as you make that educated decision, I think you'll be fine.
Thank you. Very practical advice. And I think we have the last final minutes before we wrap up the fireside chat. And usually I would like to ask the expert before we wrap up, would there be a one-liner elevator take-home that you want to advise us before we go back and forget everything, start messaging again?
No, I'm just going to leave you with one thing. Whether you like it or not, the problem exists. Most of us in this room have it. Recognize it. Do something about it so you don't become a statistic. That's all I can say.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for your attention. Yep.